story of David, almost for sure, maybe the most famous story in the Bible, period. It is so well known, so well told and heard about, talked about. And, it's well known in pop culture as much as it is in kind of a church context. So it is probably the number 2 most used sports metaphor, behind, of course, number 1 being Cinderella. I mean, the Cinderella story, everybody uses that one. But number 2 is David and Goliath, right? It's the small basketball team from rural Indiana that's taking on the state champ in the big city for the basketball title. Or, you can hear Jim Nance in March Madness, and he's calling the little St. Mary's College who's playing the big blue chip Kentucky Wildcats and their evil head coach, John Calipari. I mean, he's not really evil. It's just that's the way the metaphor plays out, because the Goliath is always kind of the villain, the evil villain, the big Kentucky Wildcats. Now, that one about the March Madness hurts a little because my beloved Tennessee Volunteers, they were kind of the Goliath that fell to the little David in the tournament. So I can't talk any smack about March Madness this year. Maybe next year. There's always next year. Malcolm Gladwell, you've heard of him. He's a popular author, and he writes prolifically in the business world. So Gladwell dedicated an entire book to David and Goliath. He says, Underdogs, Misfits, and the Art of Battling Giants is his book. And in his book, he captures pretty much the broad interpretation that we hear of what this story of David and Goliath is all about. Here's what Gladwell has to say. We consistently get these kinds of conflicts wrong. Giants are not what we think they are. The same qualities that appear to give them strength is often the source of their greatest weakness. So the place that the book goes is to say that basically he wants to motivate you and inspire you that, even though you are David and you're facing Goliath, you can still prevail. You can still win the day. You can still have this, this victory if you keep believing in yourself, keep trying and working hard to achieve this. You can beat the giant. But I want you to think about that. Why is it that we so readily identify with David? Why are we so quick to kind of hear the story of David and Goliath, and we're so drawn in to say, I am, David? It's because we see ourselves so often in life as the David in the story. We are overmatched, overwhelmed, outgunned. We feel all of that pressure that you would think of the one that cast in the role of David. And we feel that way because, unfortunately, in this broken world, that's kind of the way things are. We suffer in this world many times in that role of David, of wanting to find our way out, but feeling the pressure of Goliath kind of in our face. And my fear here in the kind of the pop culture sort of teaching around David and Goliath is that we have been so misled by the incredible truth God wants to teach us in 1 Samuel 17 of how to fight, how to enter the valley and engage the battle with this Goliath. We have been so misled that we almost have become disillusioned with the prevailing narrative, and we're almost dismissive of it. Like, if I was to put myself in the role of David, I know how that ends, and I have had enough of losing that battle, and I'm not sure I'm ready to enter the fight again. But is this the messages that we're hearing that we think about when it comes to David and Goliath? Is that actually what the Bible story that we read just a moment ago, that Jackie read from 1 Samuel 17, is that what God is trying to teach us? And so what I want to do today, I want us to kind of look at two misconceptions that are kind of common, that are very much a part of the quotes and the vibe of the pop culture feel of interpreting David and Goliath, and understand from those, what is it that God is saying to us in 1 Samuel 17? Beginning with our first misconception, which is this. This is a story that's all about David and Goliath. Now, to be clear, David and Goliath are very much the main characters, so no disputing that. Definitely see David and Goliath, in this story prolifically. However, this story is ultimately set up that we would see a comparison between David and Saul. And if you see that leading up to the storyline in 1 Samuel chapter 17, what you'll see is that there is all of this lead up to and then display of kind of David and Saul that will then carry on in the book of 1 Samuel. And because of that, we kind of get this feel of, well, what does the narrative want to teach us in chapter 17? Because until we kind of get a feel for what's the story supposed to teach us, we are prone to kind of misinterpret, like, what is the lesson, the message, if we don't know why the story was told. So let me show you a little background here from the book of 1 Samuel. Chapter 15, verse 26. Saul is rejected as king because of his disobedience from the Lord. Chapter 16, verse 13. David is anointed king, and it says the Spirit of God rushed on him. That's the passage we looked at together a few weeks ago, talking about the call of David. Chapter 16, verse 14. Saul is tormented by a harmful spirit, which then, of course, David is summoned to the palace to try to play music to soothe, this troubled conscience of Saul. And then after our passage in chapter 17, we see in 18:10, a harmful spirit rushed on Saul. A lot like the Spirit of God that rushed on, except this was a harmful spirit. And so this is the pattern that's playing out of David and Saul, of this work that God is doing, and then the lack of the presence of God. And so what we're going to see in chapter 17 is, how does this dynamic play out in the way each man responds to Goliath? That's what we're going to see in chapter 17. So let's look at Saul's response. So look at verse 8. It says, he, Goliath, stood and shouted at the ranks of Israel, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you are servants of Saul? I defy the ranks of Israel this day. And when Saul and all Israel heard these words, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So Goliath has contempt for, defies the armies of Israel, and he specifically calls out Saul. He says, are you not servants of Saul? So he is, he's effectively saying, I defy all you puny little people and your puny little leader, Saul. He's calling out Saul very specifically here. And it works, because you've got Saul afraid, the people are afraid, and commentator J.P. Lang, theologian who did a commentary on 1 Samuel, he kind of dives into this to the point of saying that Israel is afraid because its king, Saul, is afraid. And so it's almost operating in the reverse, that there's this fear in the camp. But I want you to kind of get a little bit of the context here, because I feel like maybe this is a little foreign to us, the scene that's playing out here in 1 Samuel 17. So in the modern world, we don't see a king out on the battlefield, do we? They're in the Oval Office. There's, I can't really see Biden out there, on the front lines. Like, that's just not the picture we think of when we think of a modern head of state leader out there on the battlefield. In the movie Wonder Woman, Gal Gadot, she is playing Wonder Woman, and she's having this meeting with these kind of stuffy military leaders in Great Britain, and she says back to them, as they're kind of pushing back, saying, well, you can't go out and fight. And so she says to them, Where I come from, generals don't hide in their offices. They fight with their soldiers. And so she was kind of drawing on this experience of the Amazonians where she's like, what we do is we see our generals, they're out there fighting with us, out there against the enemy. That's what it looks like. And the reason that, that's kind of different for us, in the days of Saul and David, what you would have seen is much more like this experience of the kings being on the front lines. And the reason for that was that, you didn't have a democratic election process, kind of like what we think of today. If you wanted to rise to power in this world, it was through military force. You sent your army into battle, you conquered, and you became the king by virtue of, you conquered this foe. And so if you wanted to be the king, then you needed to be present and leading that army because that was where the power was drawn from. And so military leaders would be the ones that became national leaders, and they would not be giving that kind of authority away to, some under person that would rise in the ranks. They needed to have that power. So you needed to be on the battlefield leading your troops if you wanted to have that kind of, because that's how power worked in the days of Saul and David. It was also a means, you think about, what a incredible rallying for the armies to see your king fighting with you. I mean, imagine how powerful that must have been, how motivating. Think about Braveheart, William Wallace, the great Scottish freedom fighter. He, you see him, face painted on his horse in front of his troops, and he's saying, "Will you fight for your freedom?" How inspiring would that be for those that would follow Wallace into battle? That's the effect of this leader. And that is what Israel is expecting of Saul. They're expecting him to be our king, be our military leader, go out and go before the armies of Israel to win this victory in battle. But Saul was in no place to do this. He is overcome with fear. And his fear creates the exact opposite effect on the army. Instead of inspiring them, it is actually what is creating this crippling effect of fear, where Israel feels the same impact of, we can't go into battle. Our leader is not ready for that. So Saul, he had left this place as God's anointed. We talked a little bit about kind of in previous chapters where this anointing left. And now he's so tormented that he can't even function in the confines of the palace, the comfortableness of even being in his own palace. He can't function there, much less into the battlefield to face Goliath. I mean, that kind of a place where fear has taken over, he can't do that. That's not a place where Saul is comfortable to step out as we see him in 1 Samuel 17. Now compare this to David. David, verse 22, this is what he has to say. Behold, the champion Goliath came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before, and David heard him. I love that. David heard him. It's kind of like that. If the wrong person hears what you just said, there's no going back now. You said the wrong thing to the wrong person, and it's on. And that is exactly right. And David's like, he hears that, and he is jealous for the name of the Lord. And he is jealous for the people of Israel, and he is going to see that through, and he is not going to let this pass. And this difference between Saul and David, that's the contrast that we're seeing in 1 Samuel chapter 17 as they face the same words of Goliath and what each man has to say. So where does this kind of confidence and boldness and power come from for David? How does he, in fact, engage the fight with Goliath? Well, I want to talk about that in a little more detail in our second misconception that we see around this story, and that is that this is a story about an underdog defeating a giant. No, it's not. So the lesson that we're hearing all the time, the underdog defeating, this is exactly the Malcolm Gladwell, Jim Nance, and all the other kind of pop culture analysts. This is the messaging that we hear. But the truth is, we cast David as the underdog and Goliath as the favorite because we don't understand who the participants are in this battle. Now look at how David speaks about how he enters this battle. Look at verse 34. He says, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, he took the lamb from the flock. I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of its mouth. And if it arose against me, I caught him by the beard and struck him and killed him. The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will deliver me out of the hand of the Philistine. So David here, he makes reference to his work as a shepherd. He says, when I kept sheep. So he is this shepherd, and he's kind of pointing back to that. And what he says is, when I do in this work, I'm protecting the sheep from the lion and the bear. And this is what I do as a shepherd, and that's what I'm going to do with this Philistine. That's the role he's going to play. But don't make the mistake of reading this and saying, well, yeah, that's how, the battle is won. He kind of takes in transferable skills of how he beat the lion and the bear. Because that's not the point of these kind of battle skills that David is pointing at. What he's saying about himself is a wholly different message. And that comes right into contrast with kind of the pop culture kind of thought process of you've just got these transferable skills that I could use from this one thing to the other. Like, for instance, I've got this pinpoint accuracy with my sling that ultimately is going to be used, or I've got this quickness, like kind of as if, Goliath, you've got size. And then David would say, well, I've got speed. Like this is kind of the offensive to defensive counterpoints. Or, you come at me with javelin and spear, and I come at you with, kind of these whole other set of weapons with a sling and a stone and all of this different, kinds. But that's not what David says here. What David says, his tactical advantage, is categorically different. He says, you come at me with spear and javelin, and I come at you with the name of the Lord of hosts. He's got a wholly different reason for why I can enter the battle. And what David learned as a shepherd, look at what David learned as a shepherd. He wasn't learning hand-to-hand combat skills like this is how you defeat the bear and the lion, you grab them by the beard. Like, he doesn't say, well, I'm going to just use that learned skill. What's the skill he learned as a shepherd? It was that when I enter the battle, it is the Lord who fights for me. That's what he learned as a shepherd. That's what he takes into this battle. In Psalm 23, he states it so boldly. He says, the Lord is my shepherd. David is saying, I am a shepherd of the sheep. I do this caring for my sheep. I protect my sheep. But the Lord is my shepherd. What he learned was that God is the one who cares for and protects David. This is what he learned as a shepherd. And he says, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff comfort me. So David here, he's speaking about this rod and staff. So he's talking about the tool that a shepherd would use, right? This rod and staff. He's talking about like that stick that you would see shepherds kind of carrying. And they would use that rod, that staff to kind of guide the sheep. He would also use it to protect the sheep, to strike the whatever the predator that might be coming for the sheep. He would use that. And so what David is saying here is that rod and staff are in the hand of my shepherd, which is the Lord. He is the one that's carrying this to protect me, to defend me, who goes into battle with me with his rod and staff that he could protect me against the likes of a Goliath who is in battle with me. Now, how do we understand this same truth of the Lord is my shepherd? Well, in John chapter 10, Jesus reveals, I am the good shepherd. He says, that shepherd that David was reflecting on, saying that the Lord is my shepherd, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. And the good shepherd doesn't run away like the hired hand. He lays down his life for the sheep. Jesus is that good shepherd. And at the cross, Jesus won our freedom. He brought our forgiveness from sin. He defeated hell and the grave for us. Jesus is the ultimate champion who entered the battlefield and won that victory for us. To quote a popular song we've done here, this is how I fight my battles. This is how I engage the fight. He fights for me. He is the one that I put my trust in. Now, I want to go back to Psalm 23 for just a minute. I want to show you something else about Psalm 23 here. So it says, even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. So think about the valley with me for a minute. So when you think about the valley, a lot of times, you think about kind of, poetically speaking, kind of a dark place that's, this kind of intimidating place, an evil place. Some commentators take this idea of the valley and they try to use a little bit like the imagery of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10, where the Good Samaritan, he's on this treacherous road from Jericho to Jerusalem. And it's in this valley. And so these thieves would be in the hills because they can prey on that traveler down there on this road that goes through this valley. And so there's this danger, the valley of the shadow of death. Like this is the danger that is feared for walking on this road. And I would agree. I think interpreting the valley of Psalm 23 like this in terms of maybe a place that's evil and dark, kind of generically, so that we can kind of see that. I think that's a very fair way to understand it. But in David's life, I want you to see this. In David's life, this absolutely is the battlefield. The valley he's talking about, look what he says. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This valley of the shadow of death that David is entering in his life includes the battlefield where there is this enemy that is present, that's fighting against him. And so when you think about this imagery of the valley, when you think about those thieves in the parable of the Good Samaritan, where they're in these hills and they can attack that traveler, there's kind of this strategic advantage, this kind of tactical advantage that thieves would have. And that's the same thing in a military setting that you would expect, where people would have this kind of advantage in a military engagement as well. So, what would happen is if you have this high ground as an army, you have better visibility. You can see what your opponent is doing. You also have momentum, where you're fighting an opponent at lower ground and you're on the higher ground. You have all this advantage over your enemy that you're fighting against. So what happens is the forces, the armies, they gather in the mountain and they have this advantage, and then the other force gathers on the other mountain. And there's this valley between them. And that's exactly what we see in 1 Samuel 17. It said in verse 2 and 3, we read, you had the armies of Israel up in one mountain, high ground, strategic advantage, and then the armies of the Philistines up here on this other mountain in the valley between them. And so it's because that valley, potentially a dangerous place. Alfred Lord Tennyson describes a situation of this battle in the valley in his poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade. So full transparency, I'm not a big poetry guy, so I don't want to misrepresent too much here. I've never actually read this poem until I saw it in a movie, The Blind Side, with the story of Michael Orr and Sandra Bullock and Tim McGraw, the parents. But I did read the poem after I saw it in the movie. Like, I read the poem, so this is what the poem said after I went back and read it. It said, "All in the valley of death rode the 600, forward the light brigade." So, all into the valley of death. So what happened in this engagement was British forces were sent in. They were sent into the valley of death. And so they faced these overwhelming odds of this Russian force that was waiting, and they entered the valley at this tremendous tactical disadvantage. They were in the valley. They were in the kill zone. They had these forces above the valley, these Russians that were outgunned, outnumbered, and they were able to then ultimately, the 600 perished. They were ordered by their leaders to enter the valley. They entered the valley, and they ultimately died because of that, that being such a precarious, such a disadvantage for them to have to face. And that's the visual we get of what is it in the valley. So Goliath enters the valley. He says, I'm going to sacrifice my tactical advantage to go into the valley. And he says that because I defy you, armies of Israel. He says, I can give up my advantage because I'm so bold and so confident that even if I have this advantage given up, I know I can still win the day. I can still prevail against the armies of Israel. But David also enters the valley. And he enters the valley not because he thinks, well, I have just as much military prowess or size or strength as Goliath. He says, as he says in Psalm 23, when I enter the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil because it is God who fights. So I can enter the valley. So the valley is a dangerous place. You are exposed. You could be confronted with an enemy, with danger. You're exposed and threatened in that place of the valley. So are you willing to enter the valley? Are you willing to step out into this potentially exposed place that's dangerous? David was in this place of faith where he was willing to enter the valley, but Saul was not. So which is a description that you kind of look in your life and you say, this is where I'm at. Maybe for you, you can see some of the fear like Saul had, where you have this, sort of place that's threatening, that it's like, I don't want to enter the valley. I don't want to have this kind of threat we've been talking about of this disadvantage and this exposure. I'm not ready for that because of this fear that's in my life. Maybe you don't want to enter the valley when it comes to things like relationships, family, professional life. You have, these areas that you're like, I'm not ready to take that kind of risk. There's this picture of fear that is I think, such a powerful word for us to think about Saul, and it comes in Numbers chapter 14. And in verse 9 of chapter 14, it says this. It says, do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. So let me give you a little context here. This is Caleb and Joshua bringing this report from the visiting Canaan, the promised land, across the Jordan River. And what he says, the way they describe this, knowing all the stuff God is doing for them, he's speaking of the people in the land of Canaan. He says, their protection is removed. They even described these people, and they said basically their hearts melt, that the dread of you is consuming the people of Canaan because their protection has been removed. This is Saul. His protection has been removed. Saul, his heart melts. He is the one that has this kind of fear going on. And he has so much fear, his protection is removed such to a point that he can barely handle nights in the palace, much less enter the valley and face the enemy like Goliath. He's not ready for that because his protection is removed, because he is exposed in that place. So is that a description of you today, where you feel this kind of, spiritually speaking, your protection has been removed? And maybe that's why, for you, it's hard to say, yes, I'm going to enter the valley. I'm willing to take that step, that risk that would put me out in the valley and have all of this potential danger around me, because I don't feel the boldness and confidence, because the protection that I would have wanted to have has been removed from my life. And maybe, you're a believer today, and you have a relationship with God, but there's such a brokenness in that relationship that you don't feel like I have that place anymore where I can feel the protection to be bold enough to step into the valley, even if there is potentially danger, that I have this protection anymore. Maybe if you're not a believer, this is the description of you having never had this kind of a relationship with God, where you do have this work and therefore this boldness that we see in the life of David. But what I want you to see is that this is what your shepherd, your champion, is inviting you into. It's what he has done for you. He has gone to the cross for you. He is inviting you into this great work that he has done, that you could experience this healing of the brokenness, the reconciling of this to God, that this distance, this kind of protection being removed, that is healed through what Christ did on the cross. It is healed through that good shepherd doing his work of his life, of redeeming you and bringing you into that place where you have this forgiveness. You have his care, his protection of that good shepherd, that great champion that he has for you. Receive that today.